The white professor smirked as Darius mopped near the podium, then sneered loud enough for the class to hear. Christmas isn't for people like you. Laughter echoed. Phones came out. No one stopped it. But the janitor, once a decorated scholar, just smiled, because he'd been planning this moment for months. What he did next silenced the entire university. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The December air on Hawthorne University's campus had a way of slicing through coats and settling into bones. The kind of cold that made every breath feel earned. Frost clung to the edges of the brick walkways, and the early morning light washed the buildings in a pale, unforgiving gray. Inside the humanities wing, the warmth was artificial and uneven, humming through vents that never quite reached the floors. It was there, just outside Lecture Hall B, that Darius Cole moved with measured patience, his mop gliding across the tile where a careless student had spilled a cup of coffee moments earlier. The smell of burnt espresso mixed with disinfectant, sharp and bitter, clinging to the air as if it refused to leave. Darius worked quietly, his posture straight despite the slight ache in his shoulders, eyes lowered not in submission but in habit. Years of being unseen had trained him to occupy space without disturbing it. Through the thick wooden doors of the lecture hall, a voice carried, polished, confident, and unmistakably pleased with itself. Professor Reginald Braxley was already mid-lecture, his tone rich with theatrical warmth, as he spoke about holiday traditions, about the meaning of Christmas in what he called the American sense. He paced at the front of the room, tailored blazer pressed sharp silver hair neatly combed, projecting the image of a man who believed authority belonged to him as naturally as breath. Students sat in tiered rows, some attentive, others half distracted, fingers tapping on laptops as Braxley's words rolled over them. He spoke of values, of heritage, of the importance of preserving what mattered, all while decorating his rhetoric with jokes that landed softly, but carried an edge. It was the kind of lecture that sounded inclusive on the surface, and exclusionary in its bones. Darius pushed the mop bucket closer to the doorway, intending to finish quickly, and disappear before anyone took notice. But as he leaned in to wipe the last streak near the podium, the room shifted. The scrape of his mop against the tile drew eye. Braxley paused, his smile tightening just enough to signal irritation, then amusement. He glanced down at Darius, lingering, as if assessing not just the interruption, but the man himself. The pause stretched too long. Students exchanged glances, sensing a moment forming, unsure whether to brace or relax. Darius kept his focus on the floor, his movements careful, controlled, aware of the weight of the room pressing against his back. Braxley's voice cut through the silence, light but sharp, coated in a false chuckle that invited complicity. He made a remark about distractions, about timing, then tilted his head slightly, and added, "Christmas isn't for people like you." The words landed with a dull thud, heavy and unmistakable. A few students laughed reflexively, uncertain and nervous, the sound brittle and quick. Others froze, eyes widening, hands hovering over keyboards. The room held its breath, suspended between denial and recognition. Braxley smiled wider, as if daring anyone to challenge him, his gaze never leaving Darius. For a moment Darius felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the quiet pressure that came when the world tried to remind him of where it thought he belonged. His grip on the mop handle tightened, knuckles whitening, but his face remained composed. He had learned long ago the cost of reacting too quickly, of giving people like Braxley exactly what they expected. Instead he straightened slowly, meeting the professor's gaze for the briefest second. There was no anger in his eyes, no visible hurt, just something unreadable, something that made Braxley's smile falter before he recovered. Darius nodded once, a small deliberate gesture, and returned to his work without a word. The lecture resumed. Though the energy had shifted, Braxley continued speaking, but his words felt thinner now, stretched over the silence that followed his remark. Students struggled to refocus, the glow of their screens reflecting unease. A young woman in the second row pressed her lips together, fingers clenched in her lap, while a student near the aisle glanced back at Darius with a mixture of guilt and curiosity. The janitor finished wiping the floor, rolled the bucket back, and exited the room with quiet efficiency, leaving behind a space that felt subtly altered, like a crack had formed beneath the polished surface. In the hallway, the cold seeped back in through the glass doors at the far end, but Darius welcomed it. He paused for a moment, resting his hands on the mop handle, allowing himself a slow breath. The insult echoed in his mind, not because it was new, but because of how casually it had been delivered. how easily it had been absorbed by the room. He had heard variations of it, his entire life, wrapped in jokes, in policies, in smiles. What made this moment different was not the cruelty, it was the timing, the setting, the fact that it had been spoken aloud, in front of witnesses, by a man who believed himself untouchable. As Darius moved down the corridor, past bulletin boards advertising holiday events and diversity panels, he felt the weight of memory stir. This campus held more for him than anyone knew. Every brick, every classroom carried echoes of a past that had been carefully buried, replaced with a version of history that favored men like Braxley. Darius had spent the semester watching, learning, observing patterns repeat themselves with minor variation. He had mopped these floors while overhearing conversations about merit and excellence, about tradition and standards, always spoken in ways that conveniently excluded people who looked like him. Each slight, each whispered comment had been noted, catalogued, stored away with quiet intention. Back inside Lecture Hall B, Braxley wrapped up his lecture with a flourish, dismissing the class early, as if to signal generosity. Students filed out, some animated, others subdued. A few lingered, debating whether to speak up, whether to question what they had just witnessed. Most chose silence, telling themselves it wasn't their place, that they might have misunderstood. Braxley packed his notes, satisfaction settling back into his posture, unaware of the subtle shift he had triggered. To him it was just another remark, another assertion of dominance in a space he believed he owned. Darius, meanwhile, continued his rounds, his routine unchanged on the surface. He emptied trash cans, wiped down railings, nodded politely when acknowledged. But beneath the calm exterior, his mind was active, threading connections between moments that others dismissed as isolated incidents. He thought of the students who had laughed, the ones who hadn't, and the ones who had looked away. He thought of Braxley's confidence, rooted not just in personal arrogance, but in an institution that had shielded him for years. And he thought of the small, deliberate steps he had been taking since the first day of the semester, steps that no one had noticed, because they assumed a janitor's presence meant nothing more than maintenance. As the morning wore on, whispers began to ripple quietly through the campus. Someone mentioned the comment in a group chat. Someone else replayed the moment in their head, feeling discomfort sharpen into something closer to anger. Darius overheard fragments as he passed by, catching his name spoken in hushed tones. He did not correct anyone, did not insert himself into the narrative forming around the incident. He knew that stories had a way of growing on their own, especially when fed by truth. By the time the bells rang for the next class, Darius stood alone near the maintenance office, looking out at the snow beginning to fall. Each flake drifted down softly, blanketing the campus in a temporary illusion of purity. He allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The remark had been public. The witnesses were many, and the groundwork had already been laid. What Braxley and the rest of the university didn't realize was that Darius hadn't come back to this campus to disappear into its corners. He had come back with purpose, with patience, and with a plan that had been unfolding quietly all semester. As the snow thickened outside, Darius turned away from the window, ready to take the next step, knowing that the professor's careless cruelty had just accelerated something far larger than anyone in that lecture hall could imagine. The question was no longer if the truth would surface, but how explosive it would be when it did. Because Darius Cole was done being invisible, and the clock had officially started ticking. Darius Cole had perfected the art of moving through spaces without leaving a trace. After the lecture hall incident, he returned to the maintenance corridor where the hum of old fluorescent lights filled the silence, a sound so constant it faded into the background like a held breath. He washed his hands slowly in the utility sink, watching the water run over skin that had once turned the pages of academic journals and held chalk between long fingers. The reflection staring back at him from the dull metal mirror looked older than his years, shaped by restraint rather than time. The uniform hung loosely on his frame, a deliberate choice, one that made him blend into the institutional scenery. To most people on campus, Darius Cole was a function, not a person, someone who cleaned, repaired, and vanished before questions could form. That invisibility had once felt like a punishment. Now it felt strategic. Long before he learned how to disappear, Darius had been known for the opposite. There was a time when his presence commanded attention without effort, when students leaned forward as he spoke, when faculty meetings paused to listen. He had arrived at Hawthorne University years earlier, not as a janitor but as a rising scholar, fresh from a doctorate earned with distinction and military commendations that spoke to discipline and leadership. His lectures had been rigorous, and expansive, weaving history, ethics, and lived experience into something students described as transformative. He challenged assumptions without humiliating, demanded excellence without cruelty. For a brief luminous stretch he had believed he belonged there. That belief cracked quietly at first. It began with small exclusions, committee invitations that never came, research grants that stalled without explanation, conversations that stopped when he entered the room. Darius noticed the pattern even when he told himself not to. He recognized the tone colleagues used when praising him, admiring but cautious, as if his success were something fragile that might provoke discomfort if acknowledged too openly. Still, he worked harder, published more, mentored students others overlooked. He believed merit would eventually outweigh unease. It was a comforting illusion, one he carried until the day it shattered completely. The scandal that ended his academic career arrived dressed as concern. A complaint surfaced, vague but serious, accusing Darius of being intimidating during a closed-door discussion with a junior colleague. No evidence accompanied the claim, just language carefully chosen to imply threat without naming it. Meetings were scheduled, then rescheduled. Whispers filled hallways. He was suddenly no longer welcome to walk. Darius asked for specifics, for context, for the chance to respond. He was told the process required discretion. Behind those closed doors, decisions were already being made. The words risk management and institutional reputation replaced fairness and truth. When the formal notice came, it was clinical and final. He was placed on leave pending investigation. His classes reassigned, his office sealed, students emailed in confusion, some in outrage, but their messages went unanswered by administrators who insisted the matter was sensitive. Darius watched his career dismantle itself in real time, not through overt condemnation, but through silence. The investigation concluded without resolution, the stain remaining even as proof never materialized. He was encouraged to resign quietly, to accept a settlement that required non-disclosure. The message was clear: disappear gracefully, or be erased publicly. The fallout extended beyond the campus. Funding evaporated. Invitations to conferences dried up. Colleagues who once sought his collaboration stopped returning calls. Even friends grew distant, unsure how to navigate association with controversy. The uniform he wore now was not just a symbol of demotion, it was the final stage of a long descent engineered by implication rather than fact. To survive, Darius took work where questions were minimal, and explanations unnecessary. Janitorial shifts offered anonymity and a steady paycheck. He told himself it was temporary. Years passed, yet Hawthorne University never truly left him. When the maintenance job opened, something pulled him back despite the risk. Walking those corridors again felt like stepping into a memory that refused to stay buried. He accepted the position with a calm that masked intent, observing how little had changed beneath updated signage and diversity slogans. He listened as new professors echoed old attitudes with more polished language. He watched students struggle against systems that rewarded compliance over curiosity. And he watched Professor Reginald Braxley rise further, his influence expanding, his reputation protected by the same mechanisms that had destroyed Darius. Braxley's presence was not incidental. Their paths had crossed years earlier, back when Darius still carried a faculty badge. Braxley had smiled then too, a thin, knowing smile, offering praise laced with condescension. He had questioned Darius's methods in meetings, framed concerns as academic rigor while subtly undermining credibility. Darius had sensed the hostility but underestimated its reach. Now, mopping floors beneath Braxley's lectures, the old tension returned, sharpened by time. The professor's remark about Christmas was not an isolated cruelty. It was a continuation of a narrative that had begun long ago. What no one on campus understood was that Darius had not returned simply to endure. He had returned to observe, to document, to remember. He kept notes, not written, but mental, of patterns, language, alliances. He noticed which administrators attended which events, who laughed at whose jokes, who stayed silent when lines were crossed. His military training had taught him patience, the value of reconnaissance before action. His academic training had taught him how institutions protected themselves. Together, they formed a dangerous combination. In the days following the lecture hall incident, Darius felt the atmosphere around him shift. Students looked at him differently, curiosity flickering behind politeness. Some offered awkward apologies. Others avoided eye contact altogether. He responded to each with the same measured calm, never confirming or denying the story spreading quietly through group chats and dorm rooms. He knew attention could be useful, but only if controlled. The power imbalance that had once crushed him now offered a strange advantage. No one expected the janitor to have a strategy. Unbeknownst to him, not everyone dismissed the moment as an uncomfortable footnote. One student, seated near the aisle that morning, had noticed the way Darius paused before responding to Braxley's remark. It wasn't the stillness that stood out, but the restraint, the sense that something vast had been deliberately contained. That student replayed the scene later, unsettled by how easily authority had been abused, and how deliberately Darius had chosen silence. Curiosity gnawed, growing sharper with each retelling of the incident. By the end of the week, that curiosity turned into action. The student began asking quiet questions, pulling at threads that led beyond the janitor's cart and into the university's carefully curated history. And as those questions multiplied, Darius continued his work, unaware that the first crack in the wall he'd been circling for months had just been widened by someone who refused to look away. Madison Lakewood had grown up in a house where activism was more than a dinner table topic. It was a duty. Her parents were veteran attorneys who had marched in protests, led legal battles for marginalized communities, and taught her to recognize injustice, not just in the headlines, but in body language, power dynamics, and the tone people used when they thought no one was listening. Still, nothing prepared her for the jarring cruelty she had witnessed in Lecture Hall B that morning. Professor Braxley's words, "Christmas isn't for people like you," replayed in her head like a stubborn melody, refusing to fade. The way Darius had stood there, composed but visibly pierced, haunted her more than the slur itself. It wasn't just offensive, it was calculated, deliberate, designed to humiliate a man whose presence they all took for granted. She had watched the other students react. Some shifted uncomfortably. A few laughed nervously. Most stayed silent. That silence was the loudest part. Madison had stayed quiet too, paralyzed in the moment, unsure whether to confront, call out, or record. She hated herself for that now. In the days that followed, she replayed not just the words, but the room's collective failure. While others seemed eager to forget, she couldn't. Something about the look in Darius's eyes had unsettled her deeply. It wasn't just hurt, it was recognition, like he had expected it. That alone made her feel complicit. The next afternoon, she sat in the library, her untouched textbook open in front of her, its pages blurry with disinterest. Her laptop glowed with a blank search bar, cursor blinking like an impatient heartbeat. She typed Darius Cole Hawthorne University into the database, expecting nothing. Janitors didn't show up in faculty logs, but the moment she hit enter, her breath caught. A faculty listing from 12 years ago appeared, bearing his name, Dr. Darius A. Cole, Assistant Professor of Ethics and American Political Thought. There was a photo, slightly pixelated but unmistakable, younger, clean-shaven, wearing a navy blazer and a quiet smile that didn't yet carry the weight she saw in him now. She clicked, pulse quickening. The biography was brief but impressive. Veteran, Fulbright scholar, published in 4 peer-reviewed journals, founder of the campus's first Black faculty mentorship program. None of it made sense. How did a man with that resume end up pushing a mop outside a classroom run by someone like Braxley? Madison scoured archived newsletters, faculty meeting notes, old student newspaper articles. The trail was faint, like someone had tried to erase him, but not completely. She pieced together fragments, student testimonials praising his teaching, a faculty award for excellence, a guest lecture at Yale. Then suddenly, around the fall semester of 2013, he vanished. No retirement announcement, no farewell article, no departmental transition, just silence. The only hint came in a clipped announcement, buried in a PDF. Professor Cole has resigned, effective immediately. His responsibilities will be absorbed by Dr. Reginald Braxley. Her stomach churned. She dug deeper, turning to the university's internal database, accessible only through her campus login. Most students didn't bother exploring it, but Madison had used it for an investigative journalism elective. With a few credential-based maneuvers, she found her way into the faculty disciplinary archive. The interface was clunky, the filters outdated, but she persisted, sorting by the year 2013, then searching for the name Cole. Nothing. She tried Braxley instead. Still nothing relevant. It wasn't until she disabled all filters and searched by hand that she found it. File 2013-4419 Discipline. Sealed. Access restricted. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She clicked. A warning box flashed. You are attempting to access sealed university records. Unauthorized access may result in disciplinary action. Proceed. She hesitated, then hit yes. The file opened with redacted lines, but the header was visible. Subject: Dr. Darius A. Cole. Nature of investigation: alleged conduct violation. Classification: racial incident. Filed by Reginald Braxley. Madison's heart dropped, not because she had found something scandalous, but because it confirmed everything she feared. The words racial incident stung like acid. Her mind raced. Had Darius been the victim or the accused? The document's wording was sterile, bureaucratic, designed to neutralize emotion. But buried in the summary, she found a sentence that burned into her memory. Following an altercation with a junior colleague, concerns were raised about Professor Cole's tone and demeanor, which some perceived as hostile. No physical contact reported. The complainant expressed discomfort related to power dynamics and cultural tension. Cultural tension. Madison read the phrase aloud under her breath, her voice brittle with disbelief. It was coded language, the kind that universities use to hide what they didn't want to name. No clear accusation, no proof, just implication. And from that, a decorated professor's career had ended. She stared at the screen, bile rising. This wasn't just a disciplinary issue. It was erasure, a targeted takedown veiled in institutional procedure. And Braxley's name was on it. Determined to know more, she searched for the original complainant. The document only listed initials, KM, but cross-referencing the 2013 department roster led her to a now tenured professor named Kendra Malloy, then a junior faculty member under Braxley's mentorship. Madison clicked on her profile. Malloy was still at the university, still publishing, still protected. But what caught Madison off guard was a final attachment at the bottom of the file. A scanned letter dated a week after Darius's resignation. It was unsigned and typed in courier font, as if printed from an old typewriter. It read, "He didn't deserve this. I tried to stop it, but they wouldn't listen. He was too smart, too proud. That made him dangerous. Please, if anyone ever sees this, know that he wasn't the problem. There was no name, no context, just guilt soaked into paper." Madison sat back, hands trembling. What had begun as a moment of discomfort in a classroom was unraveling into something darker, something intentional. Braxley hadn't just insulted Darius, he had buried him, and the university had helped. She closed the file and backed out of the system, her mind buzzing with urgency. She couldn't unsee any of it now. She wouldn't. But what could a junior student do against an institution that had already silenced a man like Darius once? Still, she knew she had to try. She began drafting an email, anonymous, encrypted, attaching the screenshots and linking to student forums. She didn't include her name. Not yet. She wanted the truth to land without pretext. But as she typed, she noticed something else on the screen. An old archive folder labeled Cole Recordings. Her pulse quickened. She clicked only to find it password protected. Before she could attempt to guess, the library lights flickered, then steadied. She looked around. The floor was mostly empty. Only one other person remained, tucked into a study booth near the back. A girl in a hoodie. Madison closed her laptop slowly. As she rose to leave, her phone buzzed. A private message on the student server. No sender ID. Just one line of text. "Stop digging. You're not ready for what he buried." But Madison couldn't stop now, especially not after learning about the secret recordings Darius might have left behind. Madison didn't sleep that night. The anonymous message, "Stop digging," kept flashing through her mind, not as a warning but as a dare. By dawn, the fear had settled into something colder and more precise. She returned to the library before classes began, the building still half dark, the smell of old paper and coffee lingering like a secret. She logged in again, slower this time, more deliberate, tracing the same paths through the university's internal systems, with a discipline she hadn't known she possessed. What unsettled her most wasn't that the file existed. It was how carefully it had been buried. Redactions weren't random. They were surgical. Dates aligned. Names vanished. Decisions appeared without authors. Someone had engineered the story of Darius Cole's fall to look inevitable, as if it were the natural result of a man failing to meet standards rather than an institution protecting its own. She started with the complaint itself. The initials KM were no longer just letters. They were a silhouette that sharpened as Madison cross-referenced faculty directories, mentorship records, and archived committee rosters. Kendra Malloy's rise mirrored Darius's disappearance, with unsettling symmetry. In the year he was placed on leave, she received 2 grants that had previously been earmarked for his research. The semester after his resignation, she was promoted, her work praised for bringing stability to the department during a challenging transition. Madison felt a tightness in her throat as she read the phrasing. Stability, she realized, often meant silence, especially when it came at the expense of someone who made others uncomfortable by existing too fully in a space that preferred containment. Digging deeper, Madison found email threads that had escaped complete deletion. They were mundane on the surface, meeting reminders, scheduling conflicts, but threaded with implications. One message from Professor Braxley stood out, addressed to the dean and copied to Malloy. He wrote about optics and departmental cohesion, suggesting that swift action would prevent further distraction. The timing matched perfectly with the filing of the complaint. There was no direct instruction, no overt racism, just enough language to frame Darius as a liability, rather than a colleague. Madison recognized the tactic from her parents' war stories. Say nothing explicitly, let implication do the work, and trust the system to favor familiarity over fairness. What shook her most was the absence of Darius's voice. His responses, if they existed, were nowhere to be found. The record showed no transcript of an interview, no written defense, no acknowledgement of his military service or teaching evaluations. It was as if the process had moved forward assuming his guilt, his silence manufactured by omission. Madison leaned back in her chair, the screen's glow reflecting in her tired eyes, and felt anger harden into resolve. This wasn't negligence, it was choreography. She noticed another pattern then, how Professor Braxley's career accelerated in the aftermath. Committee chairs, keynote invitations, donor dinners. He became the face of the department's renewal, praised for steady leadership during a difficult period. The university magazine featured him prominently, his smile confident, his quotes polished. Madison compared the dates, the accolades stacking neatly on the timeline where Darius's name disappeared. It was a ladder built on absence. Every rung Braxley climbed seemed anchored to what had been taken from someone else. The unexpected twist came not from the archives, but from a human voice. Madison reached out carefully to a retired administrator, whose name appeared repeatedly in the old emails, a woman who had left the university shortly after Darius's resignation. She sent a vague message, framing her inquiry as a research project on institutional memory. Hours passed. Then a reply arrived, brief but weighted. The woman agreed to talk, on the condition that nothing be recorded, and no names used. They met at a cafe off campus, the kind of place that remembered conversations long after patrons left. The administrator spoke softly, eyes fixed on her cup. She didn't say Darius was innocent outright. She didn't have to. Instead, she described pressure meetings that ended before questions could be asked. Directives framed as consensus. The subtle threat of being labeled uncooperative. She mentioned how Braxley dominated rooms without raising his voice, how he framed decisions as inevitable outcomes of policy rather than choices. When Madison asked about the complaint, the woman hesitated, then said that the term racial incident had been added late in the process, not by investigators but by legal counsel, to justify swift closure. It would look cleaner that way, she explained. It would protect the university from scrutiny. Madison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Back on campus, Madison watched the narrative continue unchallenged. Braxley lectured with the same confidence, students still applauding at the end of class. Darius passed through hallways unnoticed, his cart squeaking softly, his presence tolerated but unacknowledged. The contrast was unbearable. Madison compiled everything: screenshots, timelines, emails, the administrator's anonymized account into a single folder. She named it simply Cole. The weight of it felt physical, like carrying a truth that demanded release. She hesitated only once, staring at the publish button on the anonymous forum she had chosen, a platform known for amplifying student voices when official channels failed. The risk was real. The warning message still lingered in her thoughts. But then she remembered Darius's stillness in that lecture hall, the way he had absorbed humiliation without flinching. She realized that silence had been forced on him once already. She would not participate in it again. Madison posted the files in stages, each drop carefully timed. First the faculty listing proving Darius's former status, then the disciplinary header marked racial incident, then the emails. She wrote a brief introduction, neutral in tone, letting the documents speak for themselves. Within minutes, comments appeared. Confusion, disbelief, anger. Screenshots spread. Links jumped platforms. Someone recognized Braxley's language from other contexts. Someone else recalled Darius as a beloved professor. The story gained momentum not through outrage alone, but through recognition. Too many people had seen versions of this before. By evening, the hashtag was everywhere. Alumni chimed in. Journalists requested verification. The university's PR office issued a holding statement about ongoing review. Braxley's name trended alongside phrases like institutional cover-up and weaponized process. Madison watched the numbers climb, heart pounding, knowing she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The truth was no longer contained. It was alive, moving faster than anyone could control. Across campus, Darius felt the shift before he saw it. Whispers grew louder. Students looked at him with new eyes, not pity, but recognition. His phone buzzed with an unknown number. Then, another. He didn't answer yet. He stood by the window as snow fell again, heavier this time. The campus transformed by white silence. He understood what had been set in motion. He had planned for exposure, but not like this. Not overnight. Not with a force that would make retreat impossible. As Madison refreshed the page one last time before midnight, a notification popped up. A verified account had shared the files with a single caption. "This changes everything." She closed her laptop, breath unsteady, realizing that by morning the university would wake up to a reckoning it had spent a decade avoiding. By sunrise, the story is everywhere, and the administration scrambles as Professor Braxley prepares his counterattack. It started with a whisper, but within hours, it roared like a wildfire. The post that Madison had dropped late at night had gone from a niche campus discussion to a digital tidal wave. Hashtags like Justice for Darius, Hawthorne Exposed, and Braxley Files flooded timelines. On Twitter, screenshots of the sealed disciplinary documents circled like birds of prey. On TikTok, creators stitched together timelines, dramatized voiceovers, and emotional reaction videos, some with millions of views in under 12 hours. Darius Cole, once erased so thoroughly he became invisible, was now everywhere. His face, pulled from an old faculty photo, was splashed across stories like a long-buried truth, finally clawing its way into daylight. Students who had walked past him without a second glance now scoured the forums for more. Dorm common rooms buzzed with debates and disbelief. In lecture halls, laptops clicked open mid-class to news feeds instead of notes. The student radio ran a live special with call-ins, some from alumni who remembered Darius, remembered how suddenly he vanished and how no one dared ask why. Former students, many of them now professionals, wrote open letters demanding accountability. One letter came from a black graduate now working in D.C., who wrote, "I remember Professor Cole pushing me to apply to law school when no one else believed I belonged. Hawthorne silenced him. Now we speak for him." The university remained silent for nearly a day, letting the tension ferment, and when they finally did respond, it was worse than silence. A cold, 5-paragraph press release, written with clinical detachment, was emailed to students, buried at the bottom of the university homepage, and released to media outlets, with no press conference, no signatures. It read like a denial written by lawyers. The university is aware of recent social media activity regarding past personnel decisions. While we respect the privacy of all parties involved, we reject any characterization of institutional misconduct. At this time, no credible evidence has been presented to warrant further investigation. No apology, no name, no humanity. It lit a new fire. Students mobilized instantly. By sunset, hundreds marched through the quad holding hand-drawn signs. Darius deserved better. We want truth, not policies. And who protected Braxley? The air buzzed with fury, and this time, no one looked away. Faculty began to fracture, some distancing themselves with careful neutrality, others posting subtle statements of support for transparency that stopped short of calling out Braxley directly. But a few braver or perhaps more fed up spoke plainly. A tenured black professor named Ruth Bell posted, "Darius was sacrificed to protect comfort. If you're shocked now, it's because you chose not to see it then." In the eye of the storm stood Reginald Braxley, unbothered, or at least performing the role of someone who couldn't be touched. He stood before his ethics and culture class the next morning in the same crisp suit, smiling with the same smug polish he wore during donor events. He made no mention of the scandal. Instead, he opened with a pointed monologue about mob mentality, about the danger of rumor over reason, and how the academy must protect itself from emotional hysteria. The air in the room felt dense, suffocating. Students stared at him with an unfamiliar expression, not awe, not fear, but disdain. One girl closed her notebook deliberately and walked out. Others followed. That afternoon, Braxley returned to his office in Wallace Hall, only to find something new on his door. A manila envelope, unmarked, sealed with black tape. No return address, no note. He stared at it for a long moment before pulling it down and stepping inside. Alone in the stillness of his office, surrounded by books he hadn't read in years and awards he no longer earned, he peeled the tape. Inside was a single photograph, not of him, not of Darius, but of the original complaint letter. Except this copy had handwritten notes on it, red marks circle after circle around phrases like perceived aggression, cultural discomfort, and power imbalance. In bold black ink, at the bottom, one sentence was scrawled: "You taught us how to bury people, but some of us learned how to dig." For the first time in days, Braxley's expression cracked. Across campus, the university president summoned a crisis team. PR consultants were flown in. Legal advisors whispered in closed-door meetings. The tone was shifting, and they felt it. The story wasn't just viral, it was radioactive. National outlets began circling. CNN requested an interview. NPR ran a story titled, "Academic Prestige and Racial Silence." The Darius Cole case. The Board of Trustees demanded updates. Donors paused contributions. A major corporation quietly postponed a scholarship fund announcement. The ground beneath Braxley was no longer solid. But still no formal action was taken. No apology, just damage control. Darius, meanwhile, moved like a ghost through the chaos. He continued his shifts, cleaned the hallways, swept the stairwells. He spoke little, watched much. His silence was no longer the silence of submission. It was strategy, and that silence was starting to speak louder than anything else. When he passed students now, they nodded respectfully, awkwardly, unsure how to honor him without making a scene. He nodded back, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He knew what was coming next. Exposure was only step one. Truth by itself was never enough. The machine that erased him had gears: legal, academic, psychological, and if he wanted justice, he had to break more than the silence. He had to break the machine. But before he could move, the storm hit again. The next morning, before sunrise, a security officer made his rounds in the faculty lot. Most cars were dusted in frost, their windshields opaque. But one, Braxley's, stood out. The officer slowed, flashlight beam catching something jagged. As the frost began to clear, the damage came into view: deep scratches across the hood. Not random, not vandalism for its own sake. One name, carved with deliberate fury: Darius. The metal curled around each letter, angry and deep. No taglines, no threats, just the name of a man everyone had tried to forget, now etched into the very car of the man who helped erase him. Campus police cordoned off the lot by noon. Photos spread within minutes. Braxley arrived with clenched teeth and a staged grimace, flanked by university lawyers. He called the act terrorism, in a press briefing, demanding police involvement, framing himself as the true victim. "This is the result," he said, "of false narratives and emotional manipulation by individuals who seek to dismantle truth for personal gain." He didn't say Darius's name. He didn't have to, but the crowd watching him wasn't convinced anymore. For the first time, someone from the administration interrupted him. A new voice, an assistant provost, took the mic and said the university would be conducting a formal review of all past disciplinary actions involving faculty of color. Braxley's face twisted mid-sentence. This hadn't been in the script. Meanwhile, in a quiet maintenance corridor, Darius folded a newspaper under his arm and walked away from the crowd, his expression unreadable. He hadn't touched Braxley's car. He didn't need to. The system that had protected the professor for over a decade was starting to devour itself. But as cameras swarmed the campus, a long-buried recording resurfaces, one that could destroy Braxley completely, if Madison can get her hands on it before it's buried again. 10 years earlier, Hawthorne University had worn a different face. Though the bones of it were the same, the buildings gleamed a little less. The slogans on banners were less polished, but the hierarchy was firmly intact. Darius Cole moved through that version of the campus with a confidence he had earned rather than borrowed. He was young then, sharp in both mind and presence, his lectures overflowing with students who packed the aisles and leaned against the walls rather than miss a word. He spoke with clarity and conviction, connecting theory to reality in ways that made discomfort unavoidable and growth inevitable. Students didn't just respect him, they trusted him. That trust unsettled some of his colleagues, particularly those who had grown accustomed to authority without challenge. In faculty meetings, Darius's ideas carried weight. He questioned outdated curricula, pushed for broader perspectives, and openly named the racial blind spots embedded in departmental traditions. He did it calmly, professionally, but without apology. To some, he was refreshing. To others, he was dangerous. Reginald Braxley watched him carefully during those years, offering polite smiles and measured praise while quietly tracking his influence. Braxley had built his career on knowing when to speak and when to maneuver behind the scenes, and he recognized a threat when he saw one. Darius wasn't just excelling, he was changing the temperature of the room, and rooms like that, Braxley believed, needed to be cool. The incident that sparked everything seemed trivial on paper. A closed-door discussion between Darius and a junior colleague, Kendra Malloy, following a tense committee meeting. Darius had challenged a proposal she supported, questioning its lack of inclusivity and the assumptions underpinning it. The conversation afterward was firm but professional, his voice steady, his words precise. He left believing it was resolved. Malloy left feeling something else, cornered, exposed, and acutely aware of how quickly discomfort could be reframed as danger when power felt threatened. By the end of the week, she filed a complaint describing Darius as aggressive, citing his tone rather than his words. There were no witnesses, no recordings, no corroboration, just a feeling, elevated into an allegation. Braxley moved swiftly once he heard. He framed the complaint as a serious concern in private emails, emphasizing urgency and risk. He spoke to administrators about liability, about optics, about the importance of acting before the situation escalated. In meetings Darius wasn't invited to, Braxley described him as volatile, brilliant but unpredictable, suggesting that his background made him prone to intensity. He never said race explicitly. He didn't need to. The implication hovered, unspoken but understood, activating fears that had always existed just beneath the surface. By the time Darius was formally notified, the narrative had already hardened. The meeting that followed was brief and devastating. Darius sat across from administrators who avoided his eyes, listening as they recited concerns without specifics. When he asked what he was accused of, the answers were vague. When he asked who accused him, they cited confidentiality. When he asked for evidence, they spoke of perception. The language was slippery, designed to offer no ground to stand on. He felt the room close in, not with hostility, but with indifference. His reputation, built over years, unraveled in minutes. He was placed on leave pending investigation, his access revoked, his classes reassigned without notice. Students showed up to empty classrooms, confused and angry, while Darius was escorted from his office under the guise of procedure. In the weeks that followed, the isolation was total. Braxley did not speak to him directly. Instead, he sent intermediaries, advisors, who suggested resignation might be the most dignified option. The investigation dragged on without movement. Each inquiry met with silence or deflection. Darius began to understand that the process itself was the punishment. The longer it lasted, the more his name became synonymous with suspicion. Colleagues who once laughed with him now crossed hallways to avoid conversation. The institution he had trusted revealed itself not as a place of learning, but as a machine designed to protect comfort over truth. What Darius didn't know then, what no one knew, was that the day he was called into that first meeting, something else happened. In a conference room down the hall, before the administrators convened, Braxley had spoken freely, assuming privacy where none truly existed. A device, small and forgotten, had been left behind from a previous session. It recorded everything, the calculated language, the admissions. The moment Braxley said, almost casually, that removing Darius would restore balance and avoid unnecessary cultural complication. That recording, untouched and unheard for a decade, captured the truth as it was spoken before it could be laundered into policy. As Darius signed the resignation papers weeks later, believing he had no other choice, that recording sat dormant, waiting through years of silence, through his fall from professor to janitor, through Braxley's rise, and now as the campus reeled from exposure and denial, as Madison searched desperately for proof strong enough to crack the institution's armor, the existence of that recording was about to matter more than anyone could imagine. Somewhere in the university's forgotten archives, the recording begins to surface, and once it does, there will be no way to silence it again. Madison didn't sleep again. Ever since the files went viral, her nights had become a blur of notifications, messages from strangers, and the deep, gnawing sense that she was on the edge of something historic and terrifying. She barely noticed the cold outside. She only felt the warmth of her laptop, and the electric charge of possibility. But that morning, as sunlight fractured against the blinds in her apartment, she found an envelope slipped under her door, plain, unmarked, no return address, and heavier than it should have been. Her name was scribbled in bold black ink. No courtesy, no preamble, just her heart thudded against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She opened it carefully, half afraid it was another warning, half hoping it was the breakthrough she needed. Inside was a single USB drive, nestled in a manila sleeve, its surface scuffed as if it had been carried for years in pockets and folders, passed from hand to hand, forgotten then rediscovered. There was no note, no explanation, just that unremarkable stick of memory that somehow carried destiny. Madison stared at it for a long moment, her breath caught between disbelief and exhilaration. She knew better than to assume altruism. Someone had risks, maybe even danger, tied up in that little drive. Yet something deep inside urged her forward. She tucked it into her bag and rushed toward campus. By noon, the university had become a pressure cooker of rumor and outrage. Students clustered in groups, phones raised, shouting fragments of hashtags that had spread beyond the campus and into statewide discourse. Faculty hallways buzzed with whispered conjecture, some defensive, some scandalized, most just curious. In the student commons, screens flashed news tickers demanding responses from the administration. But Madison cut through the noise, ignoring every distraction until she reached the quiet sanctuary of an empty classroom. She set up her laptop, plugged in the drive, and held her breath. Multiple files appeared, but only one had a timestamp that matched the day Darius disappeared from faculty. The file name was generic, Meeting Audio 2013-12, but the moment she hit play, the air in the room thickened. Static first, the low buzz of an old recorder, then voices clear, unfiltered in a way text never could be. She leaned forward. "We can't have this turning into a circus." Braxley's voice floated through the speaker, smooth yet sharp. "Cole has become too influential, too bold. You've seen how he speaks to students, too direct, too challenging to the status quo. It's unsettling some of our donors." Another voice, clipped and bureaucratic, spoke in response, but Braxley cut in again. "We need cohesion. We need predictability. If we push him out quietly, frame this as a courtesy leave pending review, we regain control. The department needs to look pure. Intellectual purity." Madison's breath caught. The words pure and control were weaponized there, folded into a sentence with clinical coldness. It wasn't academic disagreement. This was calculated erasure. She played on. "But without evidence?" asked a third voice, tentative. Braxley replied with a sigh that felt heavy with entitlement. "Perception is evidence when properly guided. We manage the narrative. We stabilize the environment. That's leadership." Madison sat stunned, her hands shaking. This wasn't just implication or administrative caution. It was intentional manipulation. An orchestrated campaign to silence someone powerful and vibrant, because he threatened the comfortable order. Enough to crash a career, enough to erase a man, enough to destroy a life. Her phone buzzed with an incoming alert. Hundreds of new shares, retweets, reposts. The viral storm was building again, and now she had something undeniable. She didn't pause. She pulled up the class roster for Braxley's next lecture, Modern Ethics 342, Power and Prejudice. It was afternoon. Students would be swarming. She sent a campus-wide anonymous message. No explanation, no attachments, just a time, a room number, and the words, "Truth is here. Come hear it yourself." Half an hour later, the room was packed, more than it ever had been for Braxley's class. Phones lit like a galaxy in orbit. Students murmuring with anticipation. Professors and alumni live streaming at the door. There was an electric current in the air, an awareness that something unprecedented was about to unfold. Madison stepped to the front, laptop in hand. The hum of expectant voices buzzed around her, but she felt only the weight of the USB drive and the gravity of what she was about to reveal. She looked out at faces, some curious, some skeptical, some eager for spectacle. A few whispered her name. Others glanced toward the back row, expecting to find Darius Cole, the man whose life had become the heartbeat of this campus reckoning. A moment later, Braxley entered, flanked by his usual aura of composure and denial. His eyes flicked around the room and settled on Madison with a look that was part irritation, part confusion, like a king momentarily displaced from his throne. He cleared his throat, prepared to scold, to dismiss, to command the room back into the familiar script he always wrote. But Madison ignored him. With a steady hand and a pounding heart, she clicked the audio file. The static hissed, then Braxley's voice filled the room. Unmistakable and damning. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some students covered their mouths with disbelief. Others leaned in, eyes wide. A few faculty exchanged worried stares. Braxley stood there, frozen beneath the weight of his own words, as his carefully constructed persona disintegrated in real time. And then, as the room buzzed with shock, something unexpected happened. A low murmur started at the back, growing louder, organizing itself into a presence. Darius Cole stepped through the doorway and into the classroom, not with fanfare, not with anger, but with a quiet certainty that made every head turn. His uniform was the same, but his posture had changed in the months since the scandal broke. There was a calmness about him now, like a man who had spent years watching the world through lenses, both sharp and unforgiving, refined by pain rather than defined by it. Students rose a little in their seats. Phones turned toward him. Some stood to make room for him to walk forward. The room's atmosphere shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a momentum that felt like history in motion. Braxley's face turned a shade paler than his ivory hair. He opened his mouth, probably to protest, to deflect, to command the narrative once more. But his voice never came. Darius reached the front row, eyes steady on the speaker. There was no bitterness in his expression, no desire for spectacle, only a presence that filled the room with a quiet demand for attention. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear, measured and piercing in its restraint. Truth, he said, has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply it's buried. The classroom held its breath. Before anyone could speak again, Madison looked down at her phone and froze, notifications flooding in faster than any human could read. One message, highlighted and urgent, stood out. "You think that's the only recording? There's another, and it's far worse." The room shifted. Phones lowered. Eyes turned. And in the sudden, fragile silence, Madison realized the stakes had just climbed far higher than truth alone. Because the second recording isn't just damning, it could destroy everything Darius has rebuilt, and expose a secret the university never meant to be heard. The moment the audio cut off, the silence in the classroom was so complete it felt physical, like a wall had dropped, cutting off all oxygen, all sound, all certainty. For several seconds, no one moved. Dozens of students stared at the paused playback screen, as if expecting it to flicker back to life. Others simply looked at each other, their expressions caught somewhere between shock, shame, and disbelief. What they had just heard wasn't interpretation. It wasn't rumor. It was Braxley's voice, unfiltered and clear, laying bare a calculated decision to destroy a man's career for the sake of departmental purity. And in the heart of that stillness, Darius Cole stood. He didn't rush to speak. He let the silence hang, stretch, settle. He understood its power. For years, silence had been weaponized against him. Silence in hallways, in emails, in faculty meetings, where no one had defended him. Now it was his to command. He reached slowly into his shirt pocket, unpinned the thin silver janitor's badge that had defined his presence on campus, and laid it gently on the podium in front of him. The soft metallic sound of it, touching wood, echoed louder than any voice in that moment. And then he looked up. "I've worn that badge," he began, his voice steady, low and firm, "for almost a decade. I cleaned your lecture halls, your offices, your restrooms. I scrubbed away your spills, your graffiti, your forgotten messes. Not once did I ask for recognition. Not once did I expect any of you to see me, because I knew you wouldn't." His gaze swept across the room, not with condemnation but with something more piercing: truth. "But before that badge," he continued, "I wore a different title: professor, not guest speaker, not adjunct, not diversity hire. A professor, and I earned it. Every credential, every hour, every publication. I taught in this very building. My name was on the doors you now walk past without noticing." Some students bowed their heads. Others looked away, ashamed to meet his eyes. "What you just heard," Darius said, gesturing toward the paused screen, "was not an isolated incident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a strategy, a quiet institutional strategy to remove people like me. Black, loud when necessary, unafraid to question, impossible to own. I was not a threat because I was unprofessional. I was a threat because I was excellent in a system built to expect mediocrity from people like me." The room held still, not a shuffle, not a cough. Even Braxley, who had remained at the side of the room, frozen and white-knuckled, said nothing. I was called aggressive because I said what others feared to hear. I was called unstable because I dared to be passionate in rooms that rewarded apathy. I was accused of being difficult when all I asked for was fairness. Darius stepped from behind the podium and walked slowly down the center aisle. The students parted like water. You want to know what injustice looks like? It's not always police sirens or protest chants. Sometimes it's paperwork. It's a silent black mark in a personnel file. It's a handshake that never comes. It's a door that closes 1 inch too soon. And sometimes it's the sound of your name being erased from history, without anyone blinking. Madison stood at the back of the room, her hands clenched, barely able to breathe. She knew this was the moment, bigger than her, bigger than him. This was history being rewritten in real time. Darius stopped in the middle of the room and turned slowly, speaking not like a man giving a speech, but like one handing back stolen truth. I've watched generations of black faculty disappear. I've seen women forced to smile through condescension. I've seen students gaslighted into silence. And I've watched institutions like this one hold panels on diversity, while maintaining the same power structures they swear they're dismantling. The truth hit like slow, tidal waves. You applaud black success when it's distant, when it's abstract, when it makes you feel progressive. But when it's in your office, challenging your curriculum, asking for budget equity, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, your excellence isn't the only form of brilliance, you recoil, you defend tradition. You retreat to comfort, and people like me get pushed out while you call it policy. He paused, letting that last line sit. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't disappear when you bury it. It waits. It waits in sealed files, in whispered stories, in students who pay attention. And one day, on a random afternoon in a packed lecture hall, it rises. The crowd stood silent, transfixed. I'm not here for pity, he said. And I'm not asking for my job back. I'm asking for accountability. For every name you forgot, every voice you ignored, every future you cut short because it didn't fit your image of what intelligence should look like. He looked back toward the podium where the badge still rested, glinting under the fluorescent lights. Today, he said, that badge is yours now, not because I'm returning it, but because you've earned it. You ignored, dismissed, and abandoned someone who gave everything to a place that never wanted to claim him. That badge belongs to you, not me. And then he turned and began walking out, his pace unhurried, his posture unbowed. As he reached the doorway, a quiet ripple moved through the room. One phone lifted, then another, then dozens. No one asked for permission. Madison didn't even realize she'd started recording until she saw her screen. One student whispered, "Upload it, now." The video hit TikTok at 3:17 p.m. By 4:00 p.m., it had 300,000 views. By 6:00, it passed 1 million. Comments flooded in, some angry, some weeping, some saying they finally understood what racism looked like in spaces that never shouted it, only whispered it through policy. It was the lecture no one had signed up for, but the one no one would ever forget. But as the video goes viral, the university panics, and a cease and desist letter lands in Madison's inbox, threatening legal action if the video isn't taken down immediately. By morning, the story had outgrown the campus. What began as a viral lecture clip mutated into a full-blown national reckoning, feeding the 24-hour news cycle with an appetite that could not be satisfied by silence or legal statements. Cable news hosts replayed Darius Cole's words with reverent gravity, pausing after each sentence, as if the air itself needed time to absorb them. Headlines sharpened their language as they spread across screens. Janitor or professor. A university's buried racism comes to light. The cost of purity in American academia, when institutions choose comfort over truth. The narrative was no longer just about Hawthorne University. It was about a system that had perfected the art of erasing people quietly. Reporters flooded the campus, their vans lining the streets like a second perimeter. Students found microphones thrust toward them between classes, asked how it felt to witness history from the inside. Alumni associations convened emergency calls, donors demanded explanations, and professional organizations released carefully worded statements that nevertheless carried unmistakable condemnation. The video of Darius's lecture crossed borders, subtitled in multiple languages, shared by educators, activists, and scholars who recognized the familiar pattern of institutional betrayal. For the first time in years, Darius's name was spoken with respect in rooms that had once pretended he never existed. Insane Hawthorne's administration building. Panic wore a professional face. Emergency meetings ran back to back, coffee cups piling up beside stacks of legal briefs. The board of trustees pressed the university president for decisive action. PR consultants argued optics while attorneys argued liability. And at the center of every conversation loomed one unavoidable question: Reginald Braxley. The suggestion was made, delicately at first, that he step down voluntarily, frame it as a personal decision. A chance to protect the institution from further damage. It was offered as an olive branch. Braxley rejected it outright. He held his own press conference instead, standing rigid behind a podium emblazoned with the university seal, jaw clenched so tight it seemed to grind his words into weapons. He dismissed the leaked recording as selective context, accused unnamed actors of manipulation, and leaned hard into the rhetoric of victimhood. He spoke of character assassination, of cancel culture, of the danger of letting emotion outweigh reason. And then he crossed a line that fractured whatever support he had left. He claimed Darius was playing the race card, exploiting social tension for personal gain. The words ricocheted through the media with brutal speed, each replay amplifying their cruelty. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Students who had remained neutral until then turned openly hostile. Entire lecture sections boycotted Braxley's classes, leaving him to speak to near empty rooms. Departments distanced themselves, quietly removing his name from collaborative projects. Sponsors froze funding, some issuing public statements severing ties with Hawthorne until meaningful accountability was demonstrated. A major academic conference withdrew Braxley's keynote invitation, citing concerns about values alignment. Each loss chipped away at the armor he had worn for decades. Darius watched it all from a distance, careful not to center himself in the spectacle. He declined interview requests politely, choosing silence over performance. He knew how quickly narratives could be twisted, how easily righteous anger could be redirected into something corrosive. Instead, he focused on the students, those who approached him with gratitude, those who confessed their complicity in staying silent, those who asked what came next. He listened more than he spoke, understanding that this moment was bigger than vindication. It was about exposure. Meanwhile, Madison found herself pulled into a role she never sought. Her inbox overflowed with media inquiries, legal warnings, and messages from strangers thanking her for courage she wasn't sure she possessed. She coordinated with student organizers, helped verify timelines for journalists, and fielded quiet conversations with faculty who suddenly wanted to be on the right side of history. The cease and desist letter the university had sent her now felt laughably small compared to the storm she had unleashed. Still, she felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier with each passing hour. Truth was powerful, but it was also fragile. As the pressure mounted, Braxley's composure began to fracture in subtle but telling ways. His speeches grew longer and more defensive, his interviews sharper, tinged with bitterness. He appeared less as a wronged academic, and more as a man cornered by his own words. The mask slipped further when leaked emails surfaced, messages he had sent to colleagues complaining about ungrateful students and manufactured outrage. Each leak tightened the noose of public opinion. Still, he refused to resign, clinging to his position as if it were proof of innocence rather than evidence of institutional rot. The unexpected twist came late one evening, when Madison received an email that made her hands tremble. It wasn't from a journalist or a lawyer, but from a woman who introduced herself as a former student of Braxley's. The subject line was simple: "I'm ready to talk." The message was brief, cautious, but heavy with implication. She wrote about a class she had taken years earlier, about comments that crossed boundaries, about grades that felt contingent on compliance rather than merit. She mentioned how she had filed a complaint once, only to be advised to let it go for the sake of her career. Reading it, Madison felt a cold certainty settle in. Darius's story was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. They spoke by phone the next day, voices low, pauses frequent. The woman described how Braxley wielded authority, not with overt threats, but with insinuation. How he framed discomfort as misunderstanding. How he positioned himself as mentor while eroding confidence. Her story was not sensational, but it was horrifying in its familiarity. It revealed a man who thrived in ambiguity, who understood that harm delivered quietly was hardest to prove. By the time the call ended, Madison knew this testimony could shatter whatever defense Braxley had left. As night fell, news alerts continued to light up phones across campus. Protest signs leaned against dorm walls, waiting for the next march. The administration drafted yet another statement, this one acknowledging community pain, without naming cause or consequence. And somewhere in a quiet apartment, a former student gathered the courage to step into the light, ready to tell a story that would push the reckoning beyond racism into something even more damning. Because when her account goes public, it won't just expose Braxley. It will reveal a decades-long pattern the university can no longer deny. What followed the former student's testimony was not an explosion, but a slow, terrifying unraveling. The first story broke quietly, published late at night by an investigative outlet that specialized in institutional abuse. It was careful with language, meticulous with sourcing, devastating in implication. By morning, others recognized themselves in women who had graduated years earlier, reread the article with shaking hands, realizing that what they had endured had a name, a pattern, a shared architecture of harm. Black faculty members, some retired, some still teaching under the weight of caution, began reaching out to one another, comparing notes they had never dared to share aloud. What emerged was not a series of isolated incidents, but emails poured into Madison's anonymous inbox, each one heavier than the last. A black adjunct wrote about having her syllabus corrected by Braxley to remove authors he deemed too political. A senior lecturer recalled being warned that aligning with Darius years earlier had slowed her advancement. A woman described how Braxley would praise her intellect in private, then undermine her in meetings with faint smiles and phrases like, "not quite ready," or "too emotional for leadership." The stories differed in detail but echoed the same mechanics: quiet sabotage, coded language, power exercised without witnesses. Racism and misogyny intertwined so seamlessly they were almost invisible until now. As the accounts multiplied, journalists began connecting timelines. Patterns solidified. Every accusation against Braxley followed the same arc: a challenge to his authority, followed by reputational damage framed as professionalism concerns. Those who complied survived, those who didn't disappeared. The university's role became impossible to ignore. Administrators who had approved promotions, denied grievances, and signed off on confidential resolutions appeared again and again in the margins of these stories. Silence, it became clear, was not accidental. It was enforced. Darius watched the shift with a mixture of grief and resolve. Each new story confirmed what he had long known, but never wanted to prove: that his fall had not been personal. It had been procedural. He met quietly with some of those who reached out, listening without interruption, as they described years of self-doubt, careers redirected, confidence hollowed out. He did not offer platitudes. He did not promise redemption. He understood that justice did not undo damage. It named, and naming, he believed, was the beginning of repair. Despite his reluctance, the media began framing Darius as a symbol. Headlines called him the janitor who exposed academia, the unlikely face of resistance. He hated the simplicity of it. He corrected journalists who tried to elevate him above others, insisting the focus remain on the system and the many voices finally being heard. "I'm not exceptional," he told one reporter off the record. "I'm typical. That's the problem." But the narrative persisted, because people needed a face, and his carried both pain and dignity in equal measure. On campus, the atmosphere shifted from outrage to reckoning. Departments held emergency meetings. Faculty Senate sessions stretched into the night. Students demanded structural change, not statements. The university president announced the formation of an independent review committee, a move met with skepticism bordering on contempt. The phrase had become synonymous with delay. Protest signs evolved accordingly. "We are the review. Accountability isn't optional. Stop studying us. Fix this." The unexpected twist came when internal documents leaked, showing that Braxley had been flagged years earlier by an external consultant hired to assess diversity issues. The consultant's report warned of concentrated gatekeeping power within the department and specifically named Braxley as a risk factor. The recommendation had been ignored, buried. The revelation reframed everything. This wasn't ignorance. It was choice. Pressure mounted until the board of trustees could no longer remain behind closed emails and proxy statements. They announced a special closed-door meeting to address systemic concerns raised by recent disclosures. The phrasing was cautious, but the significance was unmistakable. For the first time in the university's history, a non-faculty employee was formally invited to testify. The invitation was addressed to Darius Cole. He read it twice, then set it down. The room around him felt suddenly very quiet. This was not what he had planned. He had expected resistance, delay, perhaps even retaliation. He had not expected the institution to ask him to speak directly to the highest level of power it possessed. The invitation was both an opportunity and a trap. He knew the risks: selective listening, performative remorse, the possibility that his testimony would be absorbed and neutralized. like everything else. But he also knew what it meant symbolically. They could no longer pretend he did not exist. Madison found him later that evening, in the maintenance office, sitting alone, the letter folded neatly beside him. She didn't speak at first. Neither did he. The hum of the lights filled the space between them. Finally, she asked quietly what he planned to do. Darius considered the question, then answered with the same measured clarity he had shown in the lecture hall. "I'm going to tell the truth," he said. "All of it. And then I'm going to walk away. What they do after that is on them." Outside, the campus braced for impact. Rumors spread about what would happen in that room. Some said Braxley would resign before the meeting to avoid confrontation. Others believed the board would sacrifice him to protect the institution. Still others feared nothing would change at all. But one thing was certain. The stories could not be unspoken. Too many voices had joined the chorus. Too much evidence had surfaced. The silence that once protected power had fractured beyond repair. As Darius left the office, the invitation tucked under his arm, students watched him pass with a reverence that made him uncomfortable. He nodded politely, neither accepting nor rejecting the role they projected onto him. He wasn't a hero. He was a witness, and witnesses, he knew, were dangerous to systems built on denial. Behind closed doors, the board prepares to hear testimony they cannot control. And once Darius begins, the university will be forced to choose between truth and survival. The conference room on the top floor of Hawthorne Hall had never held such quiet tension. Its mahogany walls, once symbols of prestige and tradition, now felt like barriers to accountability. The long polished table was surrounded by figures in tailored suits. Trustees, senior deans, legal counsel, the president, and a few carefully chosen observers. They all looked prepared to perform seriousness, to listen just enough without truly surrendering control. But their confidence faltered when the door opened, and Darius Cole entered, not in janitor's uniform, but in a charcoal suit, simple, dignified, and clean. He greeted no one. He nodded once, then sat at the end of the table, facing a semicircle of power. There was no visible tension in his shoulders, no notes in front of him, no legal team by his side. But the silence that followed his arrival did not belong to the board. It belonged to him. The chairwoman of the board cleared her throat and formally welcomed him. She introduced the special closed session as part of Hawthorne's commitment to understanding, reconciliation, and transparency. The language tasted like stale wine, elegant but fermented. Darius didn't respond. He waited, and when the room finally stilled, he began. "I won't repeat what you've read in headlines," he said, voice low and exact. "I'll speak to what you buried." The air changed instantly. Some trustees shifted in their seats. One legal advisor glanced at his phone. But Darius continued. He laid out the facts without theatrics. The original complaint, void of substantiation, filled with coded language. The sealed emails where Braxley and his allies framed Darius's assertiveness as aggression, his intellect as arrogance, his leadership as destabilizing. The audio recordings, one of which had already gone viral, the others still unheard, where faculty casually referred to managing optics and keeping the department in proper hands. He referenced testimonials from women and black staff whose careers had flatlined after minor disagreements with Braxley. And when he finally looked directly at the president, his words did not accuse, they exposed. "You knew," Darius said evenly. "You signed off on my settlement. You allowed the narrative to proceed because silence was more affordable than the truth." The president said nothing, his face unreadable. "What you call a process," Darius continued, "was a machine, built to protect those who resemble you and discard those who challenge you. I didn't fail here. I was removed." Every word hung in the air like glass on the edge of a table. A few cracked. A trustee asked about the chain of documentation. Darius pulled out a printed email dated 5 days before his resignation, a discussion about his exit drafted before his interview was ever conducted. The room was no longer defensive. It was afraid. Outside, the campus was anything but silent. Nearly 400 students gathered in the quad, carrying handmade signs, megaphones, and conviction. Some had skipped class. Others had traveled from nearby universities. They chanted Darius's name, with the rhythm of defiance. "Tell the truth, tell the truth," their voices rising like a pulse. A live stream ran on 3 major platforms simultaneously, and drone footage showed the crowd stretching from the bell tower to the south gate. What began as a hearing had transformed into a trial, with the entire country watching. Inside, the board grew restless. They exchanged glances. One trustee leaned in, whispered something to the legal counsel. The chairwoman tapped her pen, then politely suggested that the session be paused for procedural clarification. Darius raised an eyebrow. "You're not pausing this," he said, calm but cutting. "You're trying to end it before you're forced to admit what this institution has done." Another trustee began to object. But Darius cut through the noise. "I'm not here for your verdict," he said. "I'm here so no one in this university ever again has to prove their humanity to people who benefit from pretending not to see it." Someone opened the door to whisper something into the president's ear. His face shifted. He leaned back, stiffly, then stood and announced the session would be adjourned until further notice. Darius stood too, but not to leave. "You close this door and I promise you," he said slowly, "it won't be the last one slammed in your face today." The board filed out in discomfort, some avoiding his gaze, others visibly shaken. The chairwoman offered a tight nod as if thanking him for something she didn't want to hear. Darius remained until the last of them left, the echo of their exit bouncing off the wooden panels. But the tension didn't dissipate. It detonated. As the news spread that the hearing had been abruptly closed, the mood outside turned. Chants became shouts. Someone banged on a trash bin. Another climbed the steps with a bullhorn and shouted, "They shut him down again." The crowd surged toward the administration building. University police attempted to hold a perimeter, but the line blurred as students pushed through the courtyard gates. Madison, standing at the edge of the crowd with a phone in one hand and a printed copy of the testimony in the other, felt the atmosphere shift from protest to uprising. Students shouted over megaphones. Signs were raised higher. Faculty who had remained silent now emerged onto the steps. Stunned, someone threw a red folder into the air, copies of a report that had been leaked just hours earlier, naming Braxley in an internal review from 2015. Pages scattered like confetti across the lawn. And then the unexpected happened. Through the sea of shouting and cameras, Braxley emerged from the side of the building, disheveled and visibly rattled. Gone was the tailored arrogance. He wore no blazer, his tie loose, his face red. He attempted to walk across the quad, perhaps thinking he could retreat to his office or car, but the path was clogged. Students noticed him almost immediately, and the chants faltered, then redirected. "There he is! Say his name, Braxley. Tell us why." Phones rose like weapons. He tried to move faster, muttering to someone at his side, but he was no longer in control. Darius stepped out from the main entrance, stopping on the first step. Their eyes met across a decade, across lies, across all the power that once kept them apart. Braxley opened his mouth, but before any words came, he stumbled. His foot caught uneven ground, his hand reached out, and in front of a sea of lenses, Reginald Braxley collapsed onto the grass. At first, no one moved. Then chaos. Someone screamed. Cameras zoomed. A medic was called. University security rushed forward, but the moment had already stamped itself into the collective memory, etched permanently across live streams and headlines. As Braxley is rushed away, a student finds something in his fallen briefcase. A letter addressed to the university president, and marked confidential, read only in event of resignation. The moment Braxley collapsed, a stunned silence swept over the quad like fog swallowing fire. Some thought it was staged, an escape act, a sympathy grab, a desperate bid to pivot the narrative. Others simply froze, unsure how to respond to a man who had spent decades wielding authority now lying powerless on the very grass his decisions had once governed. Security swarmed quickly, but the damage had already been done not to his body, but to his legacy. Dozens of camera phones had captured the fall from every angle. Streams didn't cut out. They zoomed in. The man who had dismissed Darius Cole as expendable was now gasping in front of the world, the facade crumbling on live video. But what no one could predict was what came next. In the rush to assist Braxley, his briefcase, a leather monogrammed heirloom he carried like an extension of his ego, was knocked from his hand and left behind. It cracked open against the pavement, near the sidewalk, papers spilling onto the damp ground, like unfiltered truth. A student named Bryce Chen, journalism major, and live streamer, noticed a white envelope, marked in bold ink, confidential, read only in event of resignation. Curiosity overrode hesitation. He picked it up, scanned the return address, and realized it wasn't university property. It had been sent from Braxley himself, to a private donor listed only as J.T. Aldridge, Providence Circle Trust. But the words inside were what ignited the next firestorm. Within hours, the contents of the letter exploded online. At first, only fragments were quoted, lines so vile they seemed fictional. But as full scans circulated, it became painfully clear the letter was real. It wasn't just elitist, it was overtly racist, unapologetically hierarchical, and dripping with condescension. Braxley had written it weeks before his collapse, perhaps assuming he could spin the fallout or quietly exit on his own terms. But now the words he never expected the public to read had become his final statement. The letter described the threat of cultural dilution in elite academic spaces, and referred to diversity hires as the price of social appeasement. He accused the university of folding to mob rule, led by the intellectually unqualified, calling Darius Cole by name, and referring to him as a broom-wielding fraud with a militant inferiority complex. In one section, he mocked student protesters as affirmative action dependents, cosplaying as revolutionaries. He wrote that Hawthorne's dignified history was being soiled by quotas, disguised as inclusion. There was no subtlety, no nuance, just venom, raw and undisguised. The reaction was immediate and nuclear. Within 30 minutes, the letter was trending globally under hashtags like Braxley Letter, Hawthorne Truth, and No More Silence. Academic institutions released joint statements denouncing the ideology. Political figures on both sides of the aisle weighed in. Civil rights organizations called it a historical document of modern institutional racism. Protesters flooded the campus again. Not just students this time, but former faculty, alumni, and members of the public who had watched the story unfold like a national tragedy with an all-too-familiar cast. Under growing pressure, the university released a single-sentence statement. Effective immediately, Professor Reginald Braxley has been placed on indefinite leave pending a full investigation. But to the public, the move came far too late. Leave wasn't accountability, it was retreat. Thousands demanded termination. Others demanded federal investigation into donor influence and historical hiring practices. Calls flooded the board's office. Petitions soared past 6 figures. For the first time in its modern history, Hawthorne University faced the real threat of collapse, not due to violence or finances, but from moral implosion. Darius watched it unfold, not from a podium or protest, but from the back booth of a quiet, nearly empty diner near the edge of campus. He sat alone, sipping black coffee that had long gone cold, the glow of his phone screen lighting his face as he read the letter again. It should have satisfied him, confirmation of everything he had endured, everything he had claimed, but it didn't. It hollowed him. The language wasn't shocking, it was familiar. That's what made it devastating. He had felt those words long before they were ever written, felt them in meetings, in reviews, in every paused promotion and withheld acknowledgement. Now the world finally saw them inked on university letterhead, and only then did people believe. He slid the phone aside and exhaled slowly, unsure of what came next. He had no desire for Braxley's ruin. What he had wanted, what he still wanted, was systemic truth, not individual punishment. But the letter had pulled back the curtain too far. It revealed not just one man's beliefs, but the permission he had felt to speak them in private. That was the real raw. As he paid his bill and prepared to leave, his phone rang again. Unknown number. He hesitated, thumb hovering above the screen, then answered.
Mr. Cole? The voice said, smooth and measured. This is Angela Whitaker from the National Civil Rights Legacy Foundation. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time.
Darius stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing. Go on, I'll be brief. We've been following the developments at Hawthorne closely. You've not only exposed long-standing institutional harm, you've done so with clarity, grace, and accountability. We'd like to offer you something unexpected. There was a pause. We'd like to bring you on board as a national policy advisor on educational equity. Paid, full-time, with autonomy. We believe your voice could change more than just one campus. We believe it could help rewrite the rules. Darius said nothing at first. The street outside buzzed with the same traffic that had passed him for years, unnoticed. He had walked those sidewalks with keys to storage closets. Now he was being handed a key to influence. But he knew better than to mistake the moment for a solution. I'm honored, he finally said, voice even. But I'm not interested in being anyone's token. Angela replied, her tone shifting slightly. We're not offering symbolism, Mr. Cole. We're offering a seat at the table with the understanding that you may flip it if needed. Darius smiled faintly, more tired than triumphant. I'll think about it. We'll be here, she said, whenever you're ready. As he hung up, the irony struck him. The world that once erased him now wanted him to help rebuild it. But before he can respond, Darius receives an anonymous package. Inside, a flash drive labeled only with the words, "The part they hid from you." The offer came wrapped in silence. No press release, no cameras, no announcement. Just a manila envelope slipped under Darius Cole's door one rainy morning. Inside, a letter embossed with the university seal, and a single line that changed everything. The Board of Trustees is prepared to offer immediate reinstatement, full professorship, and tenure. Beneath it, a second document, a legal settlement for damages, along with a non-disclosure agreement that would bury every ugly truth behind tidy compensation. It was, on paper, a victory, a clean return, but the silence around it reeked of rot. Darius sat at his kitchen table long after the coffee went cold, the envelope still open, his hands resting beside it, not shaking, not clenched, just like a man weighing not just options but the weight of an entire life lived under someone else's foot. For days, he spoke to no one. Madison tried reaching out, as did several students. Even a former trustee, now disillusioned by the scandal, called to urge him toward the public settlement route. "You've won, Darius. Take it, and walk away whole." But Darius didn't feel whole. He felt peeled open, dissected by months of exposure, then offered a bandage, as if that could erase decades of erasure. It wasn't just about Braxley anymore. It was about a system that kept people like Darius outside the room until it needed their silence more than their absence. He thought about his mother, how she scrubbed rich people's floors her entire life, always telling him, "Make them see your mind, baby, not your skin." He thought about that night in 2009, when he was dragged into the dean's office and told the university would be taking a precautionary step by placing him on leave, pending investigation. He remembered the letter from the university that used words like disruption and inappropriate conduct, never once naming the racial bias behind it. And now, they were ready to undo it all, not with truth, not with apology, but with a carefully crafted deal. One evening, he drove to the edge of the city, parked near the waterfront, where no one knew his name, and stared into the black water under flickering sodium lights. There, in the whisper of wind and the quiet hum of passing cars, he let the thought in. What if I destroy them? Not in vengeance, but in clarity. What if he declined the offer, rejected the hush money, and instead exposed every internal memo, every racist footnote in his record, every complicit silence that allowed Braxley to thrive? Would that heal him or consume him? He pictured returning as Professor Cole, jacket on his shoulders, students hanging on to his words, the same hallways that once watched him with suspicion now echoing with respect. But would it be earned respect, or carefully managed peace? Would he always be the symbol, the exception, the comeback story used in brochures, while the rot remained under the floorboards? Then came the unexpected twist. Madison forwarded him an email, leaked anonymously. It wasn't from the university. It was from Braxley, dated just a week prior. In it, Braxley ranted to a colleague, claiming Darius was too arrogant to accept reinstatement, and will self-sabotage like they always do. The words cut deep, not because of the insult, but because of the assumption. The system expected Darius to fall in line or burn out. It didn't believe he could stand in the middle, rebuild and lead, not without becoming either a mascot or a martyr. That night, Darius called a name he hadn't dialed in years. His old mentor, retired Professor Leonard Whitmore, the only man who'd once warned him about Braxley before things fell apart. They talked for hours, across stories of academic racism, buried careers, and the long cost of principled silence. Redemption, Leonard said, is only powerful if it's yours, not something handed to you in exchange for your silence. Darius didn't answer, but something in him shifted. On campus, speculation boiled. Students whispered, faculty watched, and social media swirled with theories. Would he take the job? Would he sue? Was he playing chess, or walking away entirely? The university, for its part, remained quiet, hoping the storm would pass with just enough hush and shine. But something was coming. Something public. The auditorium was packed. No flyers, no email blast. Just word of mouth, urgency, in whispers. Cameras were ready. Students lined walls. Faculty sat stiffly in back rows, and at the center the podium stood empty under a spotlight. Then the doors opened. Darius Cole stepped in. Not in uniform, not in silence, but in a tailored charcoal suit, the very one he once wore to teach freshman seminars before his fall. His gait was measured, his expression unreadable. In one hand, a folder, in the other nothing. He walked to the podium slowly, students parting to let him pass. Whispers faded, phones came out, even the university president sat frozen in the front row. And then Darius placed the folder on the podium. adjusted the microphone, and looked out across the sea of faces, some expectant, some skeptical, some reverent. His voice didn't tremble. I've made my decision. Darius walks into a packed auditorium, with his final answer. The room was already tense when Kendra Malloy stepped forward, her heels tapping softly against the auditorium's cold concrete floor. Her appearance was not on the program. Her presence hadn't been authorized, and yet no one stopped her. Darius turned his head slightly, watching her with the expression of a man unshaken by ghosts. She held a sealed envelope in her hand, the kind used for contracts, confessions, or both. Without speaking, she placed it on the podium beside him, her fingers trembling ever so slightly before retreating into the folds of her coat. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her face told the room what her voice couldn't. She had come to acknowledge the lie. Darius let the moment hang. Then, without touching the envelope, he returned his eyes to the audience, now a sea of silent breath and wide stares. His voice, when it came, was low but sharp enough to cut through the air like glass. Let me tell you about what it means to be erased professionally without ever being fired. The crowd leaned forward. He wasn't here to soothe. He wasn't here to be poetic. He was here, finally, as Professor Cole officially reinstated, not just by the university, but by truth itself. You can lose your title, your office, your income, your dignity, and still be expected to clean the floors of the building where you once taught. That's not just injustice. That's institutional cruelty dressed in policy. He moved away from the podium, walking across the stage like it was his classroom again. Because they told me they were giving me my job back. What they were really offering was a seat at a table they had already poisoned. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. He waited for quiet, then continued. I taught ethics on this campus. I was one of the most requested lecturers in the department, and yet when a single unverified complaint was filed, one that never claimed violence, only discomfort, I was suspended, investigated, and then told to resign quietly for the sake of the university's reputation. He turned to face the administration section, where several senior faculty sat with forced composure. His gaze settled on each one, naming them without flinching. Dean Holland, you attended the meeting where they decided I was a liability. You said nothing. Dr. Brenner, you mentored the student who filed the complaint against me, then signed the committee memo recommending my leave. Provost Gale, you wrote the final report but removed your name from the signature page. None of them responded. None dared to meet his eyes, and to those who say this was all a misunderstanding, he said, voice rising now, I offer this. Silence in the face of injustice is not neutrality. It is complicity. The audience broke into murmurs again, this time angrier, more animated. Darius paused, drawing a slow breath. Then he spoke of the system itself. The real problem isn't individuals. It's the culture that made my erasure logical. You don't have to hang a whites-only sign to preserve supremacy. You just have to redefine excellence, so that it always looks like you. A gasp echoed from the front row. You can embed racism into policy, into hiring practices, into committee dynamics, into the unspoken idea of who belongs in a serious academic space. He stopped walking now and returned to the center, where the podium stood. The envelope from Kendra still lay untouched beside him. He placed his hand gently on it. This, he said, is what's left when truth is delayed for too long. Not just a paper trail, but a soul's worth of damage. Do you know what it does to a man to be told, year after year, that his presence is tolerated but not welcomed? That his brilliance must be palatable to be accepted? The crowd was silent again, devastatingly still. I came back here not to reclaim status, but to bury a lie, and in doing so I found something bigger. Not vindication, not revenge, but the undeniable power of visibility. He turned to the students now, the ones who had protested, leaked, shouted, risked, and believed. You saw me, when the institution wouldn't, and because you saw me, the lie couldn't survive. The room erupted into applause, not polite, but volcanic. It rose in waves, clapping that turned into stomping, that turned into a roar. For 10 full minutes, no one sat, no one filmed. They simply witnessed. But it wasn't just admiration that filled the room. It was release. Decades of unspoken harm, buried narratives, whispered fears, now finally spoken aloud by the man they had tried so hard to make disappear. As the applause began to fade into steady rhythm, Darius looked out one final time, his gaze scanning the back of the room. And there, half lit in the shadow of the exit sign, stood a face he hadn't seen in over a decade. The student who once testified against him. He had been a freshman then, scared, impressionable, Misled, Braxley had used him as a pawn to back Kendra's complaint, framing Darius's firmness during class as intimidating. His testimony had sealed the perception that Darius was unprofessional, and then he vanished from the record, graduating without another word. But now he was here, older, changed, and crying. The student raises his hand, and the entire room goes silent, waiting for what he will say, and what Darius will do. Christmas at Hawthorne University arrived in a hush so deep it felt sacred. The quad was draped in pristine snow, unblemished except for the footprints of early birds and maintenance crews preparing for the holiday. The great stone buildings stood silent, their windows dark, as if even the bricks were resting after the tumultuous semester. The air was cold enough to make every breath visible, white ghosts of air vanishing almost as soon as they formed. It was a landscape built for stillness, yet under that quiet lay a year's worth of uprooted lies, shattered facades, and truths once buried, but now unable to be ignored. Darius Cole walked across the snow-covered lawn, his footsteps deliberate, leaving dark impressions on the luminous ground. He wore a thick coat, its collar turned up against the winter wind, and in his hand he carried nothing more than a simple leather portfolio. The weight of what he had lived through did not melt in the chill. Instead, it seemed to settle into his bones, anchoring him in a way he had never known when ambition and expectation once defined him. Today was not about speeches or battles. Today was about reflection, an acknowledgement of how far he had come, and how deeply the wounds of institutional betrayal had cut. The building he passed first was Wallace Hall, the same building where his professorship had ended in scandal and begun again in public reckoning. Stone steps led up to a heavy oak door that had once felt like a barrier. Now it stood as a monument to both erasure and resurgence. Darius paused for a moment on the edge of the pathway, his breath misting in the frigid air, and looked up at the darkened windows. In the stillness he could almost hear the echoes of his own voice when he had stood before thousands. The truth laid bare, the names spoken, the injustice named. That lecture had shifted more than headlines. It had changed the shape of the conversation around power and race in spaces that once prided themselves on neutrality while practicing exclusion. Inside the adjacent student center, the atmosphere was warm and bright, the kind of contrast that made the outside cold feel like a distant memory. A small crowd had gathered for the announcement of a new scholarship, the Darius A. Cole Endowed Scholarship for Equity in Education. Banners hung on the walls, red and gold ribbons tied carefully around brass plaques. Students, faculty, and alumni chatted quietly in clusters, faces lit with pride, admiration, and for some, tears. A sense of celebration pulsed through the room, but it was tempered by humility and awareness. Nothing here was shallow or performative. This was gratitude honed by struggle. Madison stood near the podium, her posture relaxed but her eyes shining with the weight of the moment. When Darius entered, conversation softened and shifted into respectful silence. She caught his gaze and offered a small nod, an acknowledgement of shared history, of battles fought and won and of the long road still ahead. The president of the university, no longer the man hiding behind polished statements, but someone reordered by accountability and public demand, stepped forward to speak. His voice was earnest, unguarded in a way that felt new in that room. Today, we honor not just a man, he said, but a truth that once we tried to hide. This scholarship represents our commitment to equity, not as a slogan, but as a lived promise to future generations. Darius Cole taught us that silence protects the powerful and injures the vulnerable. May this fund open doors that were once closed. Applause followed, gentle at first, then building, sustained, and heartfelt. Students and faculty alike stood, not out of obligation, but because they had witnessed a rare thing. Accountability in motion, the kind that changed lives, moved institutions, and forced truths into sunlight, where they could no longer fester in darkness. Darius approached the podium when the applause dwindled. He did not clutch the edges of the wood or look for reassurance in the crowd. Instead, he stood tall, arms at his sides, contemplating the faces before him. Some were friends, some had watched him suffer in silence for years. A few had never known him before the storm of revelations. But all were present now, in a moment that felt like a reclaiming. "I never asked for this," he began, his voice steady and resonant. "No one puts their name on a legacy because they wanted fame. I lost everything, my career, my reputation, my sense of belonging. What I found in return was far greater, a community that refused to look away." He spoke of pain not as a wound, but as a teacher, a relentless examiner of character and truth. He spoke of dignity found in persistence, not compromise. And he spoke of the scholarship as a promise that talented students from marginalized backgrounds would no longer face erasure cloaked in bureaucratic language. Their futures would be claimed, not negotiated away. When his words ended, there was a silence so potent, it felt like reverence. Then applause rose again, slow, deep, unhurried. 10 minutes passed in a tribute that felt less like celebration and more like healing. People wept, others clapped with intensity that shuddered through the room like thunder. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for history, but no photograph could contain the depth of what was being honored. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and the room hummed with conversation, Darius stepped outside into the snow once more. The sky was a pale sheet of winter blue, quiet and unwavering. The lawn was still untouched by footprints, as if the world paused in expectation. As Darius walked, he noticed figures moving along the paths, students bundled in scarves and coats, chatting about the future. A few older alumni, cameras slung over shoulders, lingering in thoughtful silence. The campus felt renewed, not because it had forgotten its injustices, but because it had begun to repair them. He passed the fountain at the center of the quad, now frozen into a crystal sculpture that glinted in the weak sunlight. It reminded him of fragility and strength combined. Water so free in motion now held still by cold, yet brilliant because of it. A metaphor perhaps for his own journey. Still, the unexpected twist came when he reached the edge of the lawn, near the old maintenance shed, where, years earlier, he had pushed his mop bucket and worked in silence while a different version of himself lived inside that building as a professor. Now, lives shifted in ways neither past nor present could have predicted. A figure approached him from the snowy path, a young black janitor he had often seen sweeping the walkways, but had never spoken to more than a nod. The man stood tall, shoulders squared against the falling flakes, his broom resting against his hip like a marker of pride rather than work. When he recognized Darius, something in his eyes glistened, not just in admiration, but in recognition of something deeper than words. The young janitor stepped closer, lowered his head respectfully, and whispered, his voice carried on the cold air, "Thank you, sir." Darius stopped mid-step, stunned not by applause or accolades, but by the simplicity of those words, spoken by someone whose labor had once made him invisible. In that moment, he felt the full circle of his journey, not as vindication but as transformation. Change had not been promised. It had been fought for, and now it was visible in the eyes of someone who stood with him but walked a different path. Darius smiled, not the kind worn for cameras or headlines, but a quiet, complete smile born from the knowledge that his struggle meant something larger than himself. But as he opened his mouth to reply, his phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, expecting another message of congratulations or interview request. Instead, one line blinked on the screen, a notification from a verified news account. Breaking: Federal Education Task Force announces investigation into nationwide campus discrimination practices, led by Darius A. Cole. The snow seemed to shimmer around him as the words sank in. Darius looked up from his phone, only to see someone emerging from the shadowed entrance of Wallace Hall. A face he never expected, and a truth that would redefine everything again. If you believe dignity should never depend on job titles or skin color, type yes in the comments. Have you ever seen someone silenced just because they didn't fit the system's image? Subscribe for more true stories that challenge power and expose truth. Because until justice speaks louder than tradition, our work isn't done.